Welcome, gentle dreamers, the channel where the past drifts in like twilight and every story is a candle, quietly flickering in the dark. Tonight, we'll slip back through the centuries to wander winding village lanes and echoing stone halls, where the unknown and the misunderstood shaped lives in ways both haunting and strangely human. If you enjoy letting history wash over you as you settle in for the night, don't forget to subscribe for more episodes. And leave a comment below. What moments from history whisper to you as you drift off to sleep? Let's dim the lights and journey further. During the medieval era, life for those with mental illness unfolded as a relentless interplay of fear, hope, misunderstanding, and sometimes unexpected compassion. As a child shivering in a drafty hovel might suddenly begin speaking in tongues or wander from hearth, to hedgerow muttering at ghosts only they could see, the family would gather, hushed and anxious, uncertain whether they harbored a chosen vessel of God or an accursed soul invaded by the devil. Superstition governed the household. A mother might whisper prayers over her afflicted child deep into the night, clutching a sprig of rue or a relic sewn into the hem of a tunic, desperate to draw down mercy, yet wary of becoming an object of suspicion herself. When strange behaviors persisted, suspicion simmered in the village. If the afflicted was a laborer's child, a harvest worker, their suffering might pass with little more than murmurs, quickly layered over by the day's toil and the urgent grind of survival. If, however, the afflicted was of rank, a daughter of a reeve, a widow of means, a son expected to inherit, even eccentricities demanded explanation. Was the child bewitched by a jealous neighbor, or did sin in the lineage call down darkness? In some cases, the parish priest would be summoned, his presence at the threshold a fulcrum between solace and terror. The priest might carry out a whispered exorcism with hands trembling, his Latin words fluttering in the stale air, or he would instruct the family to undertake pilgrimage, each step a penance and a plea for deliverance. The suffering individual might find themselves led, half aware, through muddy lanes or packed onto a creaking ox cart to a shrine renowned for miracles. At the shrine, flickering candles cast shadows on stone. Supplicants moaned their woes, and the afflicted became one among dozens, clinging for hope. Sometimes, after weeks away and endless prayers, a glimmer of calm or clarity would return, the coincidence noted as divine intervention. More often, the suffering continued, knowing it hope, and the community's patience waned. Among the learned, especially in larger towns or monastic centers, the sick might be examined by a physician, rare, literate, influenced by the ancient Greeks, but under the heavy gaze of the church. The physician would observe, perhaps ask questions if the afflicted could answer, and inspect urine or pulse. Diagnosis would fall into categories shaped more by tradition than insight: melancholia for deep sadness and immobility, mania for frenzied activity, folly for behavior that defied sense. Always the underlying notion was that balance had been lost within the body or soul. Treatment reflected the confusion of causes. If melancholia, then perhaps bleeding, harsh purges, or the administration of sedative herbs. The patient, weakened already by torment, might grow weaker still. Ablutions in icy water, sudden immersion meant to shock the mind back to sense, could follow. For some upper-class patients, this cycle of intervention, convalescence, and relapse could persist for years, their fates bound to the household's fortunes and the family's willingness to care. The poor, lacking such resources, might be left to wander, an object of pity or derision. Confined by their suffering, some found themselves in the care of monasteries or convents, places where the line between retreat and captivity blurred. There, amid the echoing chant of psalms and discipline of daily ritual, the mentally ill might receive basic sustenance and shelter, but always within rigid parameters of behavior. A holy fool, if harmless, might be tolerated, even indulged by a community that allowed eccentricity as a sign of God's inscrutable will. But those prone to violence or bizarre conduct risked isolation, a makeshift cell, chains, a diet increasingly meager. As the medieval centuries passed, the rise of urban centers produced new responses to visible madness. London's Bedlam Asylum, infamous even in its earliest days, became a repository for those considered lost causes. There, treatment consisted more of containment than cure. A bed in a bare cell, iron fetters, the stench of despair hanging as thick as the city fog. Some inmates were paraded for idle amusement, as bedlamites, the subject of macabre fascination, their condition conflated with moral failure or divine punishment. Parallel to these stories of suffering were rare tales of healing or adaptation. Occasionally, a person afflicted by visions or extreme behavior would recover suddenly, perhaps after a long fever broke, or a shock to the system, or, as sometimes reported in saints' lives, through the intervention of relic or prayer. Such recoveries were held as miracles, proof of God's power, reinforcing the community's faith in spiritual remedies. Equally often, sufferers seemed unchanged by ritual or medicine. If their families endured, so too did the afflicted, enduring with the rhythm of the seasons. Yet in the flickering light of candle and hearth, not all was bleak. The absence of modern stigma in some rural places allowed marginal lives. A simpleton might be fed alongside beggars at a lord's gate, or employed at menial tasks, their difference woven uncomfortably but persistently into the local tapestry. Kindness and cruelty mingled unpredictably, shaped by need, fear, generosity, and fatigue. Most telling, the fate of the mentally ill in medieval times was neither wholly static nor fully abandoned. Their journeys traced the outlines of their society's faith, fear, science, and the patchwork nature of early communal life. In the absence of clear understanding, life was negotiated at every step, sometimes worsened by cruelty and confusion, sometimes softened by ritual or compassion, but rarely healed in the sense the modern world would understand. Even as some communities learned to wrap their strangeness with a kind of shaky tolerance, the broader world continued to cast long shadows over those who lived on the margins. Among townsfolk, the passage of the mentally troubled through public squares or along parish roads was marked by a set of unspoken rules. Averted eyes, cautious gestures, sometimes a hasty sign of the cross. Behind shutters and doors, families whispered their worries, torn between the urge to protect their own and fearful that too much association might draw blame or suspicion from restless neighbors. Whispers had a way of traveling, sometimes swelling into rumor or accusation, sometimes resolving into lonely endurance. It was not uncommon for superstitions to tether madness with the changes of the moon. Villagers muttered that those caught moaning at night or weeping over invisible wounds were touched by Luna, a state that might be endured in silence as long as crops rose and no livestock failed. Other times, when tempers ran short or food grew scarce, those seen as burdens became a focus for collective unease, even scapegoats. The bonds of kinship buckled or held firm by turns, depending on need, luck, or the rare presence of a healer unafraid to intervene. Healers, herbalists, midwives, or simply the old women long learned in the ways of root and chant, sometimes tried their hand where priest and physician could not. They applied poultices of lavender for restless nights or mugwort for frayed nerves. Patients might be led through fields at dawn, the dew said to thin their fevers and quiet their minds. Rituals murmured in dialect as old as the hedgerows, played out in the blue half-light between night and day. Such efforts rarely worked more than fleeting peace. The world was stubbornly resistant to easy remedies, but there existed, for brief spans, a sense that not all hope was spent. Elsewhere, in the watchful eyes of church and nobility, madness was a disturbance best contained. Records from the edges of Christendom, castles, courts, and cloisters speak of rooms set aside for those too troubled or volatile to wander freely. In these spaces, the afflicted found themselves wrapped in thick blankets against the chill. coddled or ignored according to whims of caretakers. Their days echoed with prayers and the tolling of bells, a rhythm that could soothe or further confound. Some scribes, tasked with cataloging estates and lineages, noted the sudden absences of those once destined for inheritance. Madness could make a prince into a shadow, a daughter into a silent sister cloistered from sight. On rare and extraordinary occasions, stories turned quietly miraculous. A woman beset by visions might awaken one morning, her mind as clear and bright as the first frost, claiming the touch of a saint or angel in the night. News of these reversals sparked brief flares of hope, recounted over years until legend and memory blurred. In reality, most persisted in their altered states, years marked by small kindnesses, sudden cruelties, or simply an indifference so deep it might almost pass for gentleness. Thus, while the medieval world offered little lasting cure, it spun a web of responses, now harsh, now tender, around its most vulnerable souls. With each generation, a pattern held: rituals to ward off spirits, leeches to balance humors, isolation when nothing else seemed to work, and sometimes an unexpected acceptance as suffering wove itself into the slow, stubborn fabric of daily life. Night deepens over the patchwork fields, and behind stone walls, wind whispers through chimney cracks and haylofts, curling around souls long pressed by burdens too slippery for words. Within the cramped wooden rooms of a crofter's hut, an old woman, her son lost to tremors and visions, gazes through frost-laced glass, mind flitting between prayer and dread. She rises yet again, tapping her fragmented oil lamp, watching her boy, once sturdy and able, now curled and trembling, murmur to shadows cast against wattle and daub. Her hope, like the flame, wavers but never quite gutters out. Days pass in cycles, bound not only by weather and yield, but the caprice of the young man's mind. Some mornings dawn with gentle clarity, his eyes seek hers, and he hums snatches of remembered songs. These she cherishes, proof that some spark persists. On others, storm clouds gather behind his gaze. He recoils from touch, clawing at unseen shapes, speaking in tongues that frighten the chickens and worry the neighbors. The villagers, most of them tenants scratching life from stubborn earth, shy their children from the old track by their house, frightened whispers blossoming like weeds in idle hands. A hex has struck him, some say, or his father's sins fetched their price. In the center of the hamlet, gossip coils with the same tenacity as ivy climbing a churchyard wall. The old wise woman, her hair shredded white by time, pronounces with solemnity, sometimes madness is born under the wolf moon, sometimes it is caught like fever, sometimes, rare and wonderful, it is a sign of favor from saints not yet named. She gathers potions, foxglove, valerian, even crushed bones wrapped in red thread, and makes her visit. The ritual is both comfort and chiding, a performance balancing hope and resignation. For those like the old woman and her son, the boundaries between private torment and public suspicion are paper thin. A fitful harvest or a spate of misfortune nearby revives old fears. Perhaps he is cursed. Perhaps their hut is too close to the burial ground. Perhaps the whispers are warnings after all. The priest, when summoned, brings both incense and admonition, genuflecting before the terrified youth, intoning invocations learned by candlelight in his own uncertain boyhood. He fumbles for certainty, gazing upwards as much in search of guidance as in demonstration of faith. Sometimes he leaves relics, a splinter of bone in a box, or a ribbon tied to a cross, hoping the visible proof of prayer might anchor what words fail to reach. If the family bears status, if the afflicted is heir to a patch of arable land or bearer of a noble name, the stakes are greater still. A manor's eldest son, suddenly beset by shadows, is watched by a procession of anxious kin and retainers, each with competing interests shaped by love, fear, inheritance, or simple habit. The manor priest whispers of demonic attack, the steward consults a physician from the town, and the matron of the household dispatches servants to river shrines with offerings for Saint Dymphna, patroness of the disturbed and despairing. The physician's arrival is marked by ritual and spectacle. He carries his tools in a leather satchel, brass instruments, vials of dark liquid, and paper inscribed with wisdom inherited from Galen and Avicenna. His approach is clinical, yet dampened by the shadow of failed attempts. He examines, interrogates, and smells the patient's breath, proclaiming an imbalance of black bile or corrupt vapors lodged near the heart. His remedies are as much guesswork as science. A regime of bloodletting, purges with bitter herbs, sometimes enforced vomiting, believed to flush melancholy from the gut. Recovery is rare, but each intervention is a moment to act rather than merely suffer fate. For the afflicted noble, months pass punctuated by these cycles of hope and hurt, an endless round dance between his mother's gentle hand, his priest's desperation, and his physician's cold logic. Sometimes, the nobleman returns to himself for a week or a month, but relapses and is locked away in an upper chamber, the door watched day and night. Gossip in the village below thickens. Some say he was bewitched by the miller's wife, whose bitter tongue and untimely widowhood made her an easy target. Others claim the nobleman's strange state is a penance for pride, proof that God humbles the mighty. When violence erupts, a fit in which the young lord assails his own hound, or throws crockery until the air is choked with dust and panic, his family faces choices. Tie him to the bed with strips of linen, send for further exorcism, or, in desperation, dispatch him to the city's hospital, an act both of surrender and of hope that experts beyond their countryside can accomplish what prayer and penance could not. For some, this marks the last time the family will see their beloved alive. Cities, with their clamor and confusion, provide little comfort. The so-called hospitals, more dungeon than haven, are grim repositories for society's unwanted, the mentally ill, the disfigured, the poor, struck by accident of birth. London's Bedlam is a stone maze where moans echo through corridors reeking with filth and stale terror. Attendants, themselves weary and poorly paid, swing between indifference and cruelty, rarely able to offer comfort. Within these walls, a nobleman's name counts for little. He is another lost soul, fastened to his straw mat, waiting for deliverance, or the merciful numbness of madness so deep that he no longer hears the outside world at all. Meanwhile, in quieter villages, the seasonal wheel grinds on. Madness among common people is endured with alternating waves of patience, awe, and veiled resentment. A holy simpleton may, by luck or local tradition, find a kind of niche. He becomes the bell ringer's assistant, a harmless figure cheered by children who know him as a fixture, more animal than human in their understanding, but deserving of the crusts and the odd coin. In some cases, the village's mentally afflicted women are taken into convents, provided the family can afford the donation required by Mother Superior. Here, among the faithful, their days are measured by prayer, work in herb gardens, and for some, periods of lucidity greeted as miracles. Others fade into perpetual silence, their madness interpreted as penance or a cryptic sign from heaven. Not every tale is bleak. Stories half remembered percolate through kitchens and taverns, of a shepherd once struck dumb by terror on the moor, who, after years of muteness, found his tongue in old age and became a font of local wisdom. Of a child whose fits ceased after a near-fatal fever, the village midwife proclaiming St. Vitus's protection. Of a woman beset by sorrow, taken to Weeping Cross, and left overnight, who returned smiling and never wept again. Whether these are miracles or accidents, the community treasures them. Hope is a rare and precious thing. Yet the prevailing experience is one of long incremental struggle, marked by flashes of understanding and fits of frustration or even horror. Most mentally ill people, outside the rarefied circles of literate chroniclers, live in the margins, fed if fortune allows, beaten or abandoned when custom and patience run out. Old laws favor confinement of the violent, banishment of the inconvenient, and the occasional presentation of village idiots as pitiable amusements at fairs, a grim entertainment that soothes local anxieties by rendering difference into spectacle. Through all this, the mentally ill themselves navigate a world whose explanations rarely include their own voices. Their words, dreams, and terrors are filtered through priests, parents, magistrates, and healers. If a sufferer is literate or otherwise gifted, as with certain mystics, he or she may leave behind fragments, diaries, letters, confessions, saturated with bewilderment, faith, and occasionally, a fierce clarity that lasts only as long as a candle in a drafty room. Suffering is often compounded by poverty, but not invariably. Even the wealthy cannot always shield their kin from pain. The difference is that a well-born family can purchase cycles of intervention, seclusion, or even travel in search of healing at distant shrines. The poor, bound to the land and to each other, rely on luck, charity, and the variable tolerance of the community. Not infrequently, a madman lingers on the edge of town, sustained by scraps and the questionable protection of those who remember him as a baby, or by those who dread offending whatever shadowed spirits they believe walk beside him. One of the period's paradoxes is the mixture of brutality and surprising kindness. While some villages expel or confine the dangerous, others make space, a hand on the shoulder, a cup of broth, a quiet place by the fire. These acts do not constitute healing by modern standards. There is little hope of restoration in the medieval imagination. Instead, life is about accommodation, tolerance stretched thin by fatigue, undergirded by faith that suffering on earth might, one day, yield blessing in the hereafter. Towns and cities develop their own customs. In Paris, Rome, or Hamburg, friaries and leper hospitals make grudging room for the mentally ill, who are given menial tasks, collecting refuse, sweeping cloisters, singing monotone litanies. Their eccentricities are sometimes explained away as trials sent by God or as tokens of unworldly wisdom. Local saints' cults form around those who, despite their madness, are believed to channel divine favor. The townspeople bring their own sick for blessing, hoping that proximity to the touched will rub off as good fortune. Yet, as the centuries tick by and towns swell, patience wanes. Gaps in understanding breed violence, chains and manacles, fetters hammered by blacksmiths who say little and look away as the priest pours holy water in the shape of crosses on cold iron. Sometimes, riots or outbreaks of fear swirl when a madman attacks, or a crop blight coincides with the birth of a wild child. These episodes reinforce boundaries between the sane and the shunned, marking the mentally ill as liminal, dangerous, or sacred, but always other. In some corners of Northern and Eastern Europe, folk beliefs persist. The mentally afflicted are given amulets or made to pass through stone circles or sacred springs believed to steal away their ailments. These rituals, passed from mother to daughter and healer to apprentice, represent perhaps the most persistent hope for mercy, unmediated by church or state. When they fail, and they almost always do, the families are left with the slow, reluctant work of living alongside suffering that cannot be neatly shunted away. Thus life, for generations, unfolds as a tapestry threaded with moments of mercy and long spells of silent endurance. Each household with a sufferer invents its own rituals. Every priest and healer improvises what they can from a patchwork of tradition and hope. Though the world is cruel to the mad, it is not uniformly so. Pockets of compassion, ineffable but real, mark the era as much as chains or prayers. The voices of the afflicted, though muffled by fear and misunderstanding, flicker through the sources, glimpses of lost lives, small truths housed in trembling hands and clouded eyes. In the deep hush before dawn, beneath a sky pricked by winter stars, the old woman watches her son sleep. She knows the next day will be much like the last, uncertain, suffused with longing, but sustained just enough by habit, faith, and the hope that even the most troubled night may one day yield to a gentler morning. Beyond the narrow lanes and small holdings of rural life, the world of the mentally ill in medieval times was as varied as the patchwork quilt of lordly estates, monasteries, burgeoning towns, and the sprawl of a continent grappling with faith, famine, law, and unending uncertainty. The experience of a sufferer could change as swiftly as the landscape. A hillside hamlet with its suspicious midwives and muttering elders, a cathedral town humming with pilgrims and friars, or a fortress perched above broad fields where lineage, legacy, and madness twisted together in knots of secrecy. Within the courts of the mighty, mental affliction was a matter both public and tightly contained. Chroniclers, scribes for bishops and kings, left guarded accounts of heirs undone by sudden malaise, princes whose speech fractured into nonsense, daughters who refused meat or sleep, monarchs whose tempers flared into unprovoked rages. Such afflictions, in an age so attuned to omens, were far more than private sorrow. A trembling ruler risked not just mockery, but political catastrophe. Advisors debated quietly behind tapestries, weighing the risks. Was it safer to confess their lord's unfitness and invite chaos, or to cloak the illness with stories of fasting, penance, or mystical visitation? Queen consorts wrote anxious letters to distant kin, hoping for remedies, alliances, or even a quiet replacement, a younger sibling, perhaps not yet touched. Within castle walls, the care of the mad was both a familial obligation and a point of danger. Sympathy might flicker among servants or siblings, but fear was never far away. Sometimes the afflicted noble was sent out of sight, not to the rough asylums of the city, but to a distant abbey owned by the family, where monks could be bribed to ensure both safety and silence. The corridors of such foundations echoed with careful steps, monks assigning the care of the special guest to one or two gentle novices, tasked to bring food, clean rushes, monitor tempers, and report any sudden violence or prophetic outburst. As years unfurled, these mad nobles faded in memory, their lives reduced to records in an abbey's charter, or, more rarely, seeds of embarrassed legend. For the common folk, wandering the roads or clutching tight to what shelter they could, mental disorder was rarely so hidden and never so insulated. Unlike the privileged, a madman without means could not be spirited away to quiet cloisters. Instead, he or she moved between places, sometimes with kin nearby, sometimes entirely alone, eking out a living off scraps, begging alms from reluctant townsfolk, or trading simple labor for bread. Some earned notoriety or even grudging affection. There are tales of Mad Tom, fabled in English ballads, who appeared at markets in rags, muttered warnings of plague, fire, or the coming apocalypse, and was treated as a kind of primitive weather vane, feared, pitied, sometimes fed, sometimes beaten. Encounters with the mentally ill often became moments of communal anxiety and shared ritual. When a local woman began speaking with the voices of the dead, elders remembered old customs. They would gather outside her door, offering gifts or threats, burning foul-smelling herbs in hopes of driving out whatever spirit possessed her. Should a child develop a wild stare or begin to shriek through the night, mother scoured the countryside for the right herb, the correct prayer, or the wise woman whose whispered formulas and gentle hands might bring relief, though always with the risk that these remedies, if unsuccessful, would be blamed for making things worse, or even for inviting witchcraft into their midst. Urban spaces, growing busier and more ambitious with the passing centuries, managed madness with a mix of institutional innovation and indifference. The earliest hospitals and asylums, though pioneered for the sick poor, gradually made room, sometimes reluctantly, for the mad. Yet these were not healing places. A patient admitted to Bedlam or a similar institution could expect rough handling, relentless noise, a pallet on the stones, and very little hope of improvement. The lucky ones were those whose families managed to buy them out after a period of containment, perhaps promising never to let the sufferer wander the streets again, or agreeing to house the afflicted at a safe remove from the community. Nevertheless, a handful of stories slowly trickled back into the countryside, stories of hope, of people healed, or at least changed. Sometimes a madman's fits would suddenly resolve after his hair was shorn and thrown into the river, or an afflicted girl, kept from the moonlight and fed bitter teas, would grow calm after a season's turn. One never knew whether it was time, chance, or the will of saints. Explanations swirled and settled according to need and mood. Histories of the more educated class, preserved in parchment and stone, shed further light on perceptions of the era. Monastic chronicles tell of brothers tormented by spirits, who found some relief through rigorous prayer and manual labor, plowing the fields, copying scripture, or weaving rope until their minds eased or their bodies exhausted themselves into stillness. Some monasteries, especially those touched by reforming zeal, prided themselves on a gentler touch. Others simply locked away the unruly, offering cold stones and hard bread as both penance and warning. The suffering of these monks and nuns, backgrounded by the drone of hourly prayer, was interpreted less as medical failure and more as holy trial, a consecrated wrestling with powers that both threatened and perhaps ennobled their faith. Religious interpretation, so pervasive in every rank of society, colored not only treatment but also the very words in which madness was described. Sermons thundered that affliction comes from the prideful invitation of sin, but would sometimes caution that even the righteous might be tested by madness like Job, or given visions akin to Old Testament prophets. Prophetic utterance and mental disturbance blurred together, a dangerous ambiguity, for it could prompt veneration as easily as despair, or even execution for heresy, should one's visions prove inconvenient. Madness and miracle continued to mingle. Medieval records contain tales of holy fools, whose unpredictable behavior, walking barefoot through snow, prophesying plague, refusing food for weeks, drew both reverence and alarm. Some churches, especially those far from centralized ecclesiastical authority, tolerated such figures at the fringes. They would allow them to sweep the sanctuary, sleep in the porch, or beg at festivals, sometimes seeing their presence as a living reminder of God's inscrutable plans. There were other cases, darker and more desperate, when communal patience wore thin, or when madness turned to violence. Persecution could erupt with terrifying speed. A sudden outbreak of disease, a burning barn, a child lost in the woods. Any calamity could be traced, in the haze of fear and superstition, to the presence of the afflicted. Swift justice, usually informal and cruel, followed. Beatings, exile, or even death. The mad became scapegoats, the physical embodiment of the mysterious and the dangerous, against which mediating rituals, prayer, penance, sometimes collective fury, were deployed. Yet brutality was seldom the only option. Quiet tolerances endured, fostered less by doctrine than by necessity and neighborliness. In lean years, when survival itself was a communal gamble, the presence of a mad relative might be interpreted as a burden, an extra mouth to feed, a risk to reputation. Yet in more abundant times or better balanced households, Old Molly, or Gentle Jack, remained part of the domestic world, absorbed into the round of chores, feasts, and fireside dailies, their oddities folded into the spectrum of what a village could contain. Legally, the growing complexity of medieval society introduced new ways to categorize and manage those deemed non-compos mentis. In towns, when property was in question, juries convened to rule on a sufferer's mental capacity, and charters were drawn up to settle guardianship or inheritance. Declarations of lunacy were grave, powerful acts, at once a protection and a social scar. After such a ruling, the mad were placed under the stewardship of relatives or officials, their independence limited by the bounds of custom and law. Loss of agency sometimes offered a kind of safety, but just as often paved the way for financial exploitation or emotional neglect. Europe's multitude of regional cultures and faiths meant that nowhere did a single set of practices or perceptions prevail. In parts of Scandinavia, the mentally ill were sometimes seen as spirit-touched, to be feared but also respected, as their suffering might confer a second sight or link to ancestral spirits. In the Mediterranean, echoes of ancient pagan healing mingled with Christian ritual. Shrines peppered the landscape, and families traveled great distances, sometimes on foot, sometimes on cradles strapped to donkeys or within ox carts, to find the touch of a relic said to cure all manner of madness. Pilgrims clustered by wells, pressed coins into priests' hands, or bathed in waters turned holy by tradition, hoping for a night's peace or a lifetime's reprieve. Throughout these journeys, social fabric held together, sometimes delicately, sometimes almost unthinkingly, by the repetitive labor of care. The task of tending the mad typically fell to women, mothers, wives, elder sisters. Their labor, invisible in chronicles or official records, was the constant thread running through the centuries, binding the afflicted to the everyday world, the gentle hand restraining violence, the lullaby chasing away night terrors, the daily work of feeding, cleaning, and simply sitting beside the one whom prophecy, possession, or affliction had set apart. All the while, healers, part magicians, part kin, part outcasts, slipped through the margins of society. Some achieved local fame. Their ability to craft protective amulets, their skill with sleep-inducing herbs, their willingness to sit awake through the long hours when others' patience had long since burned away. Their remedies, whether born of knowledge, hope, or chance, carried as much risk of blame as hope of thanks. The voices of sufferers resound only in scarce and scattered echoes. When those afflicted found language, it was a language of confusion and supplication, sometimes prayers repeated obsessively, sometimes tales of demons, of invisible music, of visions no one else could see. A handful of mystics, shielded by spiritual reputation, managed to write or dictate their experiences, descriptions mingling awe and fear, a torrent of insight, sometimes indistinguishable from torment. Suffering for most did not end cleanly or dramatically. A few found peace, sometimes abrupt and unexplainable, sometimes a gentle fading as age or weakness dulled the urgency of their pain. For most, however, life continued on its relentless track. Moments of calm snatched between storms, reiterations of ritual and remedy, interposed with long spells of waiting, treading, watching, surviving. And as the centuries slipped forward, the world itself shifted. Towns grew, universities flowered, new ideas inched toward the contradictions and complexities that would one day birth modern psychiatry. But for most, in most places, healing as we understand it remained a distant promise. Instead, the rhythm of care, exclusion, prayer, and endurance persisted, a testament, for better or worse, to the capacity of medieval communities to bear the unknown, to fear it, sometimes to cherish, and sometimes to crush, but always to carry its burden into the next day's uncertain dawn. The tapestry of medieval life, for those gripped by mental distress, continued to unfold in ways both harsh and quietly hopeful, shaped by geography, faith, social position, and the slow accretion of human endurance. As time moved forward across the centuries, small but significant shifts began to take root, even as many patterns persisted stubbornly in place. In rural hamlets, the cycle of seasons remained the backdrop for survival, but with it came rituals layered upon the farmer's calendar, marking moments when hope might briefly brighten. At the solstice or near the feast days of saints known for healing, families might undertake processions, slow, shuffling pilgrimages to roadside crosses or springs said to possess holy power. A mother with a son who shivered between waking and sleep would plunge his hands into cold water, chanting phrases learned from the wise woman, urging the unseen burdens to loosen. Sometimes the waters seemed to still his trembling. At other times, the fits worsened before, mysteriously, they eased. Such rites were neither simple superstition nor empty gestures. They were woven into a worldview where physical and spiritual realms intertwined like roots beneath a tree. The mental ailment might be tied to a restless spirit, a curse from a neighbor's malice, or a sign of divine displeasure. And it was in these overlapping spheres that caretakers sought to intervene. Herbs like St. John's wort, valerian, and hops became staples in local apothecaries, used to ease anxious hearts and restless nights, their efficacy poorly understood, but often eagerly embraced. The role of women as caregivers grew more pronounced across these times. Mothers, wives, and sisters shouldered the bulk of daily tending. Their labor of soothing and sustaining was unrecorded by formal chroniclers, but essential for survival. They became experts in subtle rituals, how to sing lullabies that might distract from torment, which foods to forbid, when to shield from moonlight, and how to hold or restrain without causing harm. Their knowledge extended beyond remedy to protection, both of the afflicted and of the household's fragile peace. Meanwhile, in more populous towns and cities, approaches wrestled with both charity and control. Asylums like the ever-notorious Bedlam Hospital became emblematic of society's ambivalent approach, a place to stow away and monitor, but rarely to cure. The noise of sufferers echoing through stone corridors, the clang of chains, and harsh voices of attendants formed a grim chorus. Yet, even amidst this bleakness, some quiet gestures surfaced. Prayers whispered over beds, crude comforts arranged by sympathetic staff or family visitors, a rare herbal tea slipped to calm frantic nerves. The legal structures surrounding mental illness evolved as well. The concept of non compos mentis gained foothold in law codes, especially as property rights and inheritance became matters demanding clarity. Guardianships were established, sometimes extending into harsh restrictions, but occasionally offering a degree of stability for those otherwise vulnerable to exploitation. Town councils and monarchies issued ordinances regulating the care, containment, or exclusion of the mentally ill, reflecting how public order and fear shaped responses as much as compassion. Religious institutions remained central in these centuries. Monasteries, convents, and parish churches continued to offer sanctuary or confinement, according to their means and philosophies. Some friars and clerics developed a nuanced theology regarding mental affliction, viewing it as a test of faith, a call to humility, or even a form of suffering that made the afflicted closer to Christ's own trials. Such interpretations fostered moments of dignity and care, even as superstition and fear could spur persecution or neglect. The notion of the holy fool persisted, paradoxical figures at the margins of society who blurred line between madness and sanctity. Their eccentric antics, walking barefoot in winter, shouting cryptic truths, or embracing poverty, often inspired awe and a grudging respect. These individuals could traverse boundaries, appearing in courts, markets, and churches, their presence both a puzzle and a reminder of human frailty and divine mystery. At the same time, darker shadows loomed. Societal anxiety could erupt in violent backlash. Accusations of witchcraft were often intertwined with suspicions about madness, particularly among women. The infamous witch hunts of the late medieval and early modern periods targeted many who deviated from social norms, including those with mental disorders. Torture and execution stained this era, a grim testament to fear and misogyny, masquerading as piety. The intellectual currents of late medieval Europe also began to reshape understandings, slowly and unevenly. Universities like Salerno, Paris, and Montpellier preserved and taught classical medical knowledge, including the humoral theory, but also questioned. Scholars debated mental phenomena with growing curiosity, influenced by translations of Arabic medical texts. These discussions laid foundational stones for later medical and scientific approaches, though practical impact would remain limited for centuries. Throughout it all, The lived experience of those with mental affliction was a kaleidoscope of sorrow and small mercies, of exclusion and tender kindness. Whether bound in chains or cradled by loving hands, they navigated a world that feared, misunderstood, but occasionally embraced difference. Their stories threaded through chronicles, legal documents, and folk tales, often faint but persistent reminders of the universal human struggle with the fragile mind. In this continuing saga, one sees the roots of both the harshness and the humanity that have marked the history of mental health. The medieval world, with all its complexity, offers us a mirror and a caution, a reflection of fear's power and compassion's quiet strength, echoing still beneath the shadowed arches of time. In the medieval era, hospitals and doctors approached mental illness through a mingling of medicine, religion, and tradition, often shaped by strange and deeply rooted beliefs. The fate of a mentally ill person depended on their social rank, gender, and the resources available within their community. But certain trends and practices dominated healthcare institutions and the work of medieval physicians. Hospitals in medieval Europe were far removed from modern healing centers. Most were run by religious orders and focused less on cures and more on care, containment, and spiritual redemption. Only a minority of these institutions provided anything resembling medical treatment. Others offered shelter, rudimentary food, and prayer. By the 13th and 14th centuries, prominent asylums like London's Bedlam Hospital began specializing in the confinement of the insane. There, treatment often meant restraint, chains, manacles, solitary cells, and very little structured therapy. The conditions were grim, and suffering patients might be displayed to visitors as spectacles, their misery conflated with entertainment or moral lesson. Doctors, for their part, practiced a blend of ancient Greek humoral theory and deeply superstitious rituals. The prevailing belief, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, was that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Imbalances, especially of black bile, were thought to cause melancholy or madness. Treatments thus aimed to restore balance through a host of sometimes brutal methods. Bloodletting and purging. Doctors would drain blood, induce vomiting, or administer harsh laxatives in the hope of rebalancing the body's fluids. Leeches, cupping, and venesection were common techniques, even if these left patients weaker and more vulnerable. Cleansing baths. Water therapy was sometimes prescribed to cleanse the body and spirit, though these could include ice-cold dunks meant to shock patients back to health. Herbal remedies. Physicians and lay healers used sedative or stimulating herbs such as valerian, St. John's wort, or mugwort to calm nerves and treat sleeplessness or agitation. Fasting and dietary restrictions. Following scriptural advice, some treatments involved withholding food or setting specific diets, especially for those thought to be afflicted by sin or demonic influence. The boundary between medical and spiritual care was blurred. Priests and monks often had as much influence over the mentally ill as doctors. For many, exorcism was the treatment of first resort. Rituals to drive out evil spirits involved prayers, holy relics, the sprinkling of holy water, and placing of crosses or relics on the patient's body. These exorcisms could be punishing, with patients sometimes restrained and subjected to hours or days of prayer, fasting, and shouting in the hope of liberation. Some of the most bizarre and iconic practices were born of uniquely medieval beliefs. Trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull, a holdover from prehistoric times, persisted as a way to release evil spirits, thought to be trapped in a person's head. The operation was as dangerous as it was ineffective, but flourished in an atmosphere where possession and supernatural affliction were considered real and urgent threats. The Stone of Madness. It was believed by some that insanity was caused by a physical stone in the brain. Quack doctors and surgeons offered to surgically remove the stone of folly, an act depicted in the satirical paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, where sufferers were trepanned by fraudulent healers under the watchful eye of clergy. This practice was rare, but symptomatic of the era's desperation and credulousness. Flagellation and harsh exposure. Patients might be whipped or subjected to painful sensory overload, hot and cold baths, isolation, blaring noises, in an effort to make the body inhospitable to spirits or to force the sufferer to atone for supposed sins. Adding to this, mass hysteria and communal psychological disturbances sometimes swept entire towns. Dancing manias and tarantism reflected the era's intertwining of mental distress, religious frenzy, and folklore. Other delusions, such as lycanthropy, were interpreted by medieval authorities as demonic transformations, often leading to witch trials, persecution, or execution rather than any form of healing. Despite these harsh realities, there were periods and pockets where care was more humane. Some hospitals, local communities, and religious institutions allowed the mentally ill relative freedom as long as they weren't dangerous. In places like Geel in Flanders, mentally ill pilgrims were housed with families, benefiting from kindness and inclusion rather than punishment. But such tolerance was exceptional in a world where suffering was so often seen as the consequence of sin, supernatural attack, or divine will. All told, medieval hospitals and doctors treated mental illness with a combination of ancient medical philosophy, religious ritual, and superstition. Their practices, bloodletting, trepanning, exorcisms, fasting, isolation, and even flagellation, often failed to heal and sometimes caused grievous harm, shaped by a worldview in which the physical, spiritual, and fantastical blended seamlessly. For every soul who found comfort or temporary peace, many more left the doctor's chambers unchanged or worse, living testament to an age when hope and fear outstripped knowledge by a wide margin. The medieval world, vast and variegated, spun countless tales of the mentally ill caught in the web of misunderstanding, superstition, faith, and tentative care. Though earlier parts of our story have traced the grim realities in hamlets, manor houses, institutions, and the hands of healers, the tapestry of treatment and experience is far from worn out. Here, we venture deeper into the labyrinth of practices, beliefs, and living realities that shape the fragile existence of those burdened by mental affliction across medieval Europe. The image of care and cruelty stretches along a spectrum woven from both hope and hardship, one that stretches from whispered prayers behind closed doors in the poorest hovels, to the ritualized exorcisms in the great cathedrals, to the harsh cells of early asylums. In every space, whether humble or grand, the voices and lives of the mentally ill intersected with a complex matrix of social norms, religious dogma, medical theory, and raw human emotion. In many rural areas, where professional physicians were absent and literacy scarce, treatment arose from a deeply intuitive understanding of the body and spirit as an intertwined whole. Caretakers resorted to herbal lore, handed down through generations, layered with ritual and prayer. Plants such as mandrake, belladonna, or henbane were applied with careful caution, valued both for their medicinal potency and their symbolic association with the ethereal world. Mandrake, with its anthropomorphic roots, was thought to draw out evil or to calm the nervous system, though its poisonous nature meant treatment could as easily bring danger as relief. Alongside herbs, ritual cleansing was paramount, a blend of tactile action and symbolic meaning. Families might bathe the afflicted in water from holy wells, sprinkle salt or ashes around the home to repel malevolent spirits, or carry the sufferer through smoke produced by burning rosemary and juniper. These acts, beyond their potential psychological placebo effect, served to affirm community involvement, offering both the sufferer and the family a sense that something was being done, no matter how mysterious or intangible the outcome. But where quiet households wielded quiet remedies, the presence of a local priest or visiting monk introduced other, more weighty interventions. These ranged from solemn prayers and blessings to exorcisms, sometimes gentle supplication, sometimes violent confrontation with the invisible. The process of exorcism was a trial by fire. The afflicted might be chained, restrained, forced to fast, or subjected to prayers and holy water, sprayed with increasing intensity. A successful exorcism was cause for celebration, a testament to divine mercy. Failures were often ascribed to the sinner's lack of faith or further sin, reinforcing the stigma. Medical practitioners, though few and scattered, worked out of hospitals or private chambers in growing towns and cities, offering diagnoses based on humoral theory, astrology, and classical medical texts. Physicians regarded the brain as the seat of mental faculties, but explained dysfunction not as disease in the modern sense, but as imbalance or blockage within the body's fluids or spirits. Indeed, astrology played an outsized role in medieval medicine. Days, hours, and planetary alignments dictated when and how treatments should be administered. The moon, for instance, was believed to affect the mind profoundly. During full moons, lunacy could flare, and certain herbs or bloodletting procedures were encouraged or avoided accordingly. As astrology was intimately bound up in the church-sanctioned curriculum, after all, the heavens were God's signs. It provided an authoritative framework in which madness was interpreted as part of a cosmic order, albeit a mysterious and troubling one. One of the more conspicuous and dramatic treatments, carried out occasionally by medical practitioners, but more often by barber surgeons or charlatans, was trepanation, drilling or scraping a hole in the skull. Rooted in ancient practice and superstition, and sometimes performed on battlefield wounds thought to trap evil spirits. Trepanation for mental illness was predicated on the idea that madness originated from an imprisoned demon or corrupted humors attempting escape. Though gruesome and dangerous, and performed without anesthesia, it surprisingly persisted into the Renaissance. One can only imagine the terror of patient and family, clinging to hope that some physical intervention might release the invisible chains binding the mind. The notion of a stone of madness, a twisted medieval belief gaining some currency in the latter Middle Ages, illustrates how far credulous hope and frustration could drive medical theory. This imaginary stone, a tiny, dense object lodged within the skull, was said to cause foolishness and mental disorder. Surgeons, sometimes under the sanction of clergy or patrons desperate for cure, claimed to extract such stones with primitive instruments. Painting, satire, and folklore immortalized this practice, underscoring the era's deep fog of ignorance, but also the persistent attempt to make madness tangible and treatable. Patients subjected to these procedures were often uninsured or poorer members of society, showing the social disparities of treatment. The wealthy could afford better attention, consultation with university-trained physicians, and retreat to the relative comfort of private chambers, while the poor were more likely to be shackled in asylums or relegated to wandering. Yet even within wealthy circles, mental illness was as likely to be hidden behind locked doors as treated openly, due to the widespread fear of shame and the threat of losing inheritance rights or political power. More often than not, treatment focused on balance and adjustment rather than cure. In accordance with humoral theory, the physician might recommend then common practices such as dietary regulation, purging, bloodletting, or application of plasters and poultices. Bloodletting, in particular, was nearly universal and carried out by barbers and surgeons who called forth blood to cool the passions or remove harmful excess humors. Although modern science condemns this practice as harmful, in the medieval mindset its logic was simple, coherent, and necessitated by an underlying cosmological framework. Alongside these physical interventions, caregivers employed more subtle therapies designed to resettle the mind and spirit. Music, poetry, gentle exercise, and natural surroundings were sometimes encouraged. Monastic records include accounts of rural retreats for those afflicted, where walking amid gardens and the rhythms of religious chanting were used to soothe troubled minds. Such pastoral care, though uneven in reach and rooted in spiritual discipline, resembles the early stirrings of psychological therapy amidst the larger, harsher world. Daily life in asylums or hospitals was grim and regimented, yet moments of human kindness flickered like candles in a persistent gloom. Caretakers, often clerics or lay brothers, provided strict schedules of prayer, mealtimes, and controlled movement. The mentally ill might be given small tasks, sweeping, tending animals, preparing meals, intended to occupy restless hands and encourage routine. Work was sometimes considered a remedy, a tangible method to restore order to chaotic minds. Some patients found purpose or peace in such activities, though for others, confinement bred despair. Physical restraint was common, justified on grounds of safety and propriety, but often cruel by modern standards. Chains, shackles, and locked cells marked many institutions. Patients might be bound during violent episodes. Yet restraint also served a protective function, to prevent self-harm or attacks on others in a world without effective medication or psychiatric understanding. Over time, some reforms emerged, advocating more humane treatment and less physical punishment, though progress was slow and uneven across Europe. Among the strange beliefs and treatments was the practice of psychic surgery of sorts, symbolic acts designed to sever the sufferer's connection to demons or malign forces. For example, some healers carried out ritual cuttings or markings on patients' bodies, a ritual stylized into a medical procedure by some practitioners that sought to draw out spirits or sin. Patients might be given charms or amulets inscribed with holy words to wear, sometimes sewn into clothing or buried beneath thresholds. Such methods were as much about harnessing hope and invoking divine protection as they were about practical cure. Public spectacles, a darker dimension of treatment and perception, took place in towns and cities. Bedlam, patients and others reported as mad, could be displayed in market squares, their confused and sometimes violent behavior attracting gawking crowds. The line between care and entertainment blurred, with public attitudes ranging from sympathy to outright cruelty. Street performances involving those deemed mad reflected communal attempts to make sense of difference, but also reinforced stigma and exclusion. Wandering holy fools and miracle workers were another facet of medieval life. These men and women, often considered to be touched by God in inexplicable ways, wore rags or absurd clothing, spoke in riddles or prophecy, and moved through towns offering cryptic guidance or curses. Though some were genuinely afflicted, others consciously cultivated the role, blurring the distinctions between madness, sanctity, and performance. Their position was precarious. Venerated by some, feared or scorned by others, they embodied the boundary between the seen and unseen, the sane and the divine. The belief that madness was often linked to possession by devils or demons remained dominant throughout. The devil was the archetypal enemy, forever at work to corrupt souls and drive them mad. The Church, invested in this cosmology, framed most severe mental disturbances as spiritual warfare. Exorcists, priestly specialists trained to conduct these spiritual battles, used rituals that were theatrical and brutal, involving fasting, prayer, use of relics, and sometimes physical coercion. Their authority was immense, but their certainty uncertain. Failure to heal could be interpreted as the patient's resistance or hidden sin rather than therapeutic failure. This theological framing brought its own contradictions. On one hand, it offered hope. Victory over evil was possible through faith and sanctity. On the other, it often condemned sufferers to suspicion and punishment under the charge of witchcraft or heresy, especially women who did not fit conventional roles or who exhibited odd behavior. Witch hunts, which emerged particularly strongly toward the end of the medieval period, targeted familial caregivers, herbalists, and sufferers themselves, weaving a dark web where care and persecution were perilously linked. Throughout these centuries, the mental health landscape was enriched by a wide variety of local customs and folk practices. In some communities, mental illness was tied closely to the cycles of nature and to ancestral reverence. Rituals included passing the sufferer through standing stones, using the smoke of bound herbs to fumigate houses, or consulting local wise women who combined superstition and herbal medicine. These practices were often intertwined with early Christian rites, forming hybrids that reflected local cultural resilience.